The hum of anticipation filled the cabin as passengers shuffled to their assigned seats aboard Flight 247, a red-eye journey from New York to London. It was one of those flights where everyone seemed eager, yet exhausted. Business travelers clutching, briefcases, families trying to calm restless children, and solo adventurers with backpacks slung over their shoulders. The air carried a mix of coffee breath, faint perfume, and the sterile scent of airplane cleaning products. In row 15, a young woman named Maya settled into her window seat. She had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, a much-needed vacation, after months of relentless work at her advertising firm. Her dark curls were tied back in a loose ponytail, and she wore a simple yet elegant navy blue dress that matched her confident demeanor. As she tucked her carry-on bag under the seat in front of her, she couldn't help but glance out the small oval window, watching ground crew members scurry about like ants preparing for takeoff. Maya wasn't alone in her row. Across the aisle sat an older couple whispering sweet nothings to each other, clearly excited about their destination. To her right, however, the middle seat remained empty, for now. That changed when a tall man in his late 30s approached the row, dragging his feet with an air of entitlement. He wore an expensive suit, designer sunglasses perched on his head, and carried himself as if he owned the plane itself. "Excuse me," he said curtly, though there wasn't much room for politeness in his tone. Without waiting for a response, he plopped down heavily in the middle seat beside Maya, letting out an exaggerated sigh. His cologne wafted through the air, overpowering and unnecessary. Maya offered him a polite smile, which he didn't return. Instead, he immediately reclined his seat slightly, encroaching on her space without so much as a glance in her direction. Behind them, unnoticed by both Maya and the man, sat another passenger, a quiet figure who had boarded earlier and chosen a seat near the back of the plane. This man, whose name was Marcus, appeared unassuming at first glance. He wore a plain hoodie and jeans, blending seamlessly into the crowd. But there was something steady and watchful about him, as though he took note of everything around him, without drawing attention to himself. As the plane taxied down the runway, announcements crackled over the intercom. The flight attendants demonstrated safety procedures with practiced efficiency, but few passengers paid close attention. Most were too busy scrolling through social media or adjusting their headphones. Maya stared out the window again, trying to ignore the discomfort of sharing such close quarters with someone who radiated arrogance. Meanwhile, the man beside her pulled out his phone and began typing furiously, occasionally muttering under his breath about inefficient service and wasting time. Every few minutes he would shift in his seat, making it clear he found the experience beneath him. At one point he turned to Maya, not to introduce himself but to complain loudly about how cramped the seating was. "I don't know why they even bother selling these tickets," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the rows ahead. "It's ridiculous. I mean, look at this, it's barely enough room to breathe." Maya nodded politely, unsure whether he expected a response. When she didn't engage further, he huffed and returned to his phone, typing even more aggressively than before. Despite his complaints, there was something oddly performative about his behavior, as if he wanted everyone nearby to acknowledge his superiority. Behind them, Marcus observed silently. His expression gave nothing away, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the interaction unfold. He had seen this type before, the kind of person who believed their wealth or status made them better than others. Though Marcus rarely involved himself in such situations, something about this particular scenario caught his interest. The engines roared to life and the plane surged forward, lifting off the ground and climbing steadily into the sky. Outside the windows, clouds stretched endlessly, bathed in golden light from the setting sun. Yet inside the cabin, tension simmered quietly, unnoticed by most passengers but palpable nonetheless. Little did anyone know, this seemingly ordinary flight was about to become anything but. For now, though, all eyes were either closed, fixed on screens, or gazing absent-mindedly out the windows. The stage was set, the players in place. And soon, the events that would unfold would leave everyone stunned, including those who thought themselves untouchable. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, The initial excitement of takeoff faded into the monotony of the journey ahead. Passengers began to relax. Some dozed off, others opened books or plugged in headphones to watch movies. But for Maya, the tension in her row only seemed to grow thicker with each passing moment. The man beside her, whose name she still didn't know, continued to make his presence felt in the most obnoxious ways possible. He tapped incessantly on his phone, sighed loudly every few minutes, and occasionally muttered complaints under his breath about everything from the temperature of the cabin to the quality of the in-flight entertainment system. It was clear he wasn't used to being inconvenienced. Or perhaps he simply enjoyed making others aware of his dissatisfaction. At one point, a flight attendant approached their row with a tray of complimentary beverages. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked cheerfully, her voice warm despite the repetitive nature of her task. Maya smiled politely. "Water, please." The flight attendant nodded and turned to the man next to her. "And for you, sir?" He barely glanced up from his phone. "Do you even have anything decent? Or is it all just watered-down soda and cheap coffee? Or—" Flight attendant hesitated, clearly taken aback by his rudeness. "We have a variety of options, sir. Water, juice, soft drinks." "Fine," he interrupted curtly. "Just give me a Coke, and make sure it's cold." His tone dripped with condescension, as though he were speaking to someone far beneath him. Maya winced inwardly at his behavior. She had dealt with difficult people before, both in her personal life and at work, but there was something particularly grating about this man's attitude. It wasn't just that he was rude, it was the way he carried himself, as if he believed the world owed him special treatment simply because of who he thought he was. When the flight attendant handed him his drink, he grabbed it without so much as a thank you. As she moved on to the next row, Maya couldn't help but notice the subtle shake of the attendant's head, a silent acknowledgement of how unpleasant the encounter had been. But things escalated further when the man noticed what Maya was doing. She had pulled out her laptop and was reviewing some documents for work, determined to use the flight time productively. Her screen displayed a presentation filled with graphs and charts, along with notes she had jotted down earlier that week. The man leaned over slightly, squinting at her screen. "What's that?" he asked, his tone laced with mockery rather than genuine curiosity. "It's work," Maya replied evenly, not looking up from her laptop. She hoped her calm demeanor would discourage any further conversation. "Work?" He chuckled derisively. "On a flight? Don't you know vacations are supposed to be relaxing? Or are you one of those people who can't stop obsessing over deadlines and emails?" His words stung, but Maya refused to let him see that. Instead, she kept her focus on her screen, typing steadily. "I prefer to stay organized," she said, simply. The man smirked, leaning back in his seat. "Organized, huh? Well, good luck with that. Personally, I think it's a waste of time, especially since—" He paused dramatically, glancing at her outfit, and then back at her face. "You probably won't get very far anyway." For a split second, Maya froze. His implication hung heavy in the air, unspoken yet unmistakable. She knew exactly what he meant, that someone like her, a black woman, wouldn't succeed no matter how hard she worked. It was a sentiment she had encountered before, though rarely expressed so brazenly. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly with suppressed anger. She wanted to respond, to call him out for his arrogance and prejudice, but she forced herself to take a deep breath instead. Arguing with someone like him would only validate his behavior, and she refused to give him that satisfaction. Behind them, Marcus observed the exchange with growing unease. Though he sat several rows back, he could hear fragments of the conversation, the man's dismissive remarks, Maya's quiet composure. What struck him most was the contrast between the two. Maya's dignity in the face of insult versus the man's blatant disregard for basic decency. Marcus shifted in his seat, debating whether to intervene. He wasn't the type to insert himself into other people's business, preferring to avoid conflict whenever possible. But something about this situation gnawed at him. Perhaps it was the casual cruelty of the man's words, or maybe it was the quiet strength Maya displayed despite the obvious provocation. Whatever it was, Marcus found himself unable to look away. Meanwhile, the man seemed emboldened by Maya's silence. He reached into his bag and pulled out a magazine, flipping through its pages with exaggerated nonchalance. After a moment, he looked up again, sneering slightly. "You know, I've seen your kind before, always trying too hard, thinking you'll impress someone, but trust me, it never works." This time, Maya turned to face him directly. Her expression was calm, but there was steel in her eyes. "My kind?" she repeated softly, her voice carrying a weight that made the man pause. "And what exactly is my kind?" He faltered for a moment, caught off guard by her directness. But his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. "You know what I mean," he said dismissively. "People who think they can climb the ladder just by working harder than everyone else. Newsflash. It doesn't matter how many hours you put in, at the end of the day it's all about who you know." Maya studied him for a long moment, taking in the smug tilt of his chin and the self-satisfied smirk on his lips. Then, without saying another word, she closed her laptop and placed it gently in her bag. There was no point continuing the conversation. She realized that now. Some people weren't worth the effort. As the cabin lights dimmed slightly for the in-flight movie, the atmosphere grew quieter. Most passengers remained oblivious to the tension in row 15, absorbed in their own worlds. Yet behind them, Marcus sat upright, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story, and that sooner or later, he might have a role to play in it. For now, though, the plane cruised smoothly through the night sky, its passengers cocooned in their individual struggles and triumphs. Unbeknownst to anyone, the seeds of something extraordinary were beginning to take root, and when they finally sprouted, the impact would resonate far beyond the confines of the aircraft. The tension in row 15 lingered like an invisible cloud, heavy and suffocating. Maya sat silently, her laptop tucked away, her gaze fixed on the seat back in front of her. She wasn't one to let insults derail her completely, but this man's words had struck a nerve deeper than she cared to admit. It wasn't just his arrogance, it was the casual dismissal of her worth, as if her dreams and efforts were nothing more than a futile attempt to climb a ladder that didn't belong to her. The man, oblivious to the impact of his remarks, or perhaps reveling in it, continued to make himself comfortable. He stretched his legs out as far as the cramped space allowed, his expensive leather shoes brushing against Maya's bag. When he noticed her glance down at the intrusion, he smirked, as though daring her to say something. But Maya remained silent, choosing instead to focus on the hum of the engines outside rather than engage with someone who clearly thrived on belittling others. Behind them, Marcus leaned forward slightly in his seat, his elbows resting on his knees. His hoodie hood was pulled up, partially shielding his face, but his sharp eyes missed nothing. He watched as the man leaned back smugly, flipping through his magazine with exaggerated disinterest. There was something almost theatrical about his behavior, as if he wanted everyone around him to witness his superiority. Marcus frowned. He had seen men like this before, men who strutted through life assuming the world revolved around them. What bothered him most, however, was the way they treated people like Maya. They underestimated her strength, dismissing her quiet composure as weakness when, in reality, it took immense courage to hold your ground without stooping to their level. As the minutes ticked by, the plane's cabin grew quieter. Many passengers had drifted off to sleep, lulled by the steady drone of the engines and the dimmed lights. Even the flight attendants moved less frequently now, retreating to the galley to prepare for the meal service later. In row 15, the silence between Maya and the man became deafening. Suddenly, the man broke the quiet with another jab. "You know," he began, his voice loud enough to carry beyond their row. "I've always wondered why some people insist on taking up space where they don't belong." Maya stiffened, her hands gripping the armrests tightly. She turned to look at him, her dark eyes meeting his for the first time since their earlier exchange. "Excuse me?" she asked, her tone calm but laced with warning. He shrugged, feigning innocence. "Oh, come on, don't tell me you didn't hear me. I'm just saying, there are places where certain types of people fit better than others. Like, For example, economy class versus business class. He gestured vaguely toward the front of the plane where premium seats awaited those willing to pay extra. Maya blinked slowly, processing his words. For a moment she considered ignoring him entirely. But something inside her snapped. A tiny crack in the wall of patience she had built over years of facing similar microaggressions. This time, she decided, she wouldn't let him get away with it so easily. "You're right," she said evenly, her voice carrying a quiet authority. "There are places where certain types of people fit better than others." The man raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her response. "And what exactly does that mean?" "It means," Maya continued, leaning closer so only he could hear, "that maybe someone like you would feel more at home in a room full of mirrors. That way you'd never have to worry about seeing anyone else's perspective." The man blinked, momentarily stunned. He hadn't expected her to fight back, not with such poise and precision. For a split second, uncertainty flickered across his face, but it quickly gave way to indignation. "Are you trying to be clever?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. "No," Maya replied coolly. "I'm just stating facts. And the fact is, no matter how much money or status you think you have, rudeness doesn't make you impressive. It makes you small." Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. The man opened his mouth to retaliate, but before he could, a soft yet firm voice interrupted from behind them. "That's enough." Both Maya and the man turned to see Marcus standing in the aisle, his tall frame towering over their seats. Until now, he had blended seamlessly into the background, unnoticed by most passengers. But now, he stepped forward with an air of quiet confidence that commanded attention. "I think we can all agree this isn't the time or place for arguments," Marcus said, his tone polite but firm. "We're stuck together for the next several hours, so maybe it's best if we try to keep things civil." The man glared up at him, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Who asked you to butt in? This has nothing to do with you," Marcus met his gaze steadily, unperturbed by the challenge. "Actually, it does, because I'm sitting right here, and frankly, your attitude is making everyone uncomfortable, including me." For the first time since boarding the plane, the man seemed unsure of himself. He glanced around nervously, noticing for the first time the curious stares of nearby passengers. Some were pretending not to listen, while others openly watched the unfolding drama. Realizing he was losing control of the situation, he crossed his arms defensively and muttered under his breath, "Whatever." Marcus nodded once, satisfied that his intervention had achieved its purpose. Then, turning to Maya, he offered her a small, reassuring smile. "Everything okay here?" Maya hesitated for a moment, surprised by his sudden appearance. But then she nodded, appreciating the gesture. "Yes, thank you." With that, Marcus returned to his seat, leaving behind a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The man beside Maya sank lower into his chair, his earlier bravado replaced by simmering resentment. Meanwhile, Maya felt a renewed sense of resolve. She hadn't needed Marcus to defend her. He had merely reminded her that she wasn't alone. As the plane soared onward through the night sky, the tension gradually eased, replaced by a fragile peace. Yet beneath the surface, emotions still churned. The man's arrogance had been checked but not fully dismantled. And Marcus, having stepped out of the shadows, couldn't help but wonder what other challenges lay ahead. For himself, for Maya, and for everyone else aboard Flight 247. Little did any of them realize the true test was yet to come. The tension in row 15 had eased, for now. The man, humbled momentarily by Marcus's intervention, retreated into a sullen silence. He no longer leaned over to make snide remarks or attempt to provoke Maya. Instead, he stared out the window, pretending to be engrossed in the endless expanse of clouds outside. But his body language betrayed him. His jaw was clenched tightly, and his fingers drummed impatiently against the armrest. It was clear that his pride had been wounded and he wasn't ready to let it go just yet. Maya, on the other hand, felt a strange mix of relief and unease. She appreciated Marcus stepping in, not because she needed rescuing, but because his presence reminded her that kindness and decency still existed, even in unexpected places. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the confrontation wasn't truly over. The man beside her radiated an unspoken hostility, like a storm cloud waiting to unleash its fury. She decided to focus on reclaiming her peace, pulling out her headphones and selecting a playlist designed to calm her nerves. Behind them, Marcus settled back into his seat, though his mind remained restless. He replayed the scene in his head. The man's arrogance, Maya's quiet strength, and the way the entire dynamic shifted when he spoke up. Marcus wasn't one for grand gestures or seeking recognition, but something about this situation felt different. It wasn't just about standing up to rudeness. It was about protecting someone who deserved better. As he glanced toward row 15 from time to time, he noticed how Maya carried herself with grace despite everything. There was resilience in her posture, a quiet determination that inspired respect. For a while, the cabin returned to its usual rhythm. Passengers began stirring as the flight attendants prepared for meal service. The aroma of reheated meals wafted through the air, mingling with the faint scent of coffee brewed in the galley. Conversations resumed softly, laughter bubbled up here and there, and the earlier tension seemed almost forgotten, except by those involved. When the food cart reached their section, the flight attendant greeted each passenger warmly. "Chicken or pasta?" she asked, holding up two options. "Chicken," Maya replied with a polite smile. The flight attendant turned to the man next to her. He hesitated, inspecting the trays with obvious disdain before settling on chicken as well. When his meal arrived, however, he immediately launched into a critique. "Is this supposed to be edible? Look at this, it's barely warm," he complained, waving his fork dramatically. The flight attendant forced a tight smile. "I'm sorry to hear that, sir. Would you like me to see if we have another option?" He huffed loudly, clearly intending to draw attention to himself. "Forget it. Just take it away. I don't want anything from this subpar service." His words dripped with condescension, and several nearby passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Maya kept her gaze fixed on her own tray, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. But Marcus, watching from behind, noticed how the flight attendant's hands trembled slightly as she collected the rejected meal. It was subtle but telling, a sign of how such behavior wore people down. As the cart moved on, Marcus leaned forward again, speaking softly but firmly. "You know," he said, addressing the man directly this time, "people work hard to keep this flight running smoothly. Maybe instead of complaining about every little thing, you could show some gratitude." The man twisted around in his seat, glaring at Marcus. "Are you seriously lecturing me again? Who made you the morality police?" "No, one," Marcus replied calmly. "But I do believe in treating others with basic respect. If that bothers you, then maybe you should reconsider why you're so quick to criticize everyone else." Their exchange drew curious looks from neighboring passengers, including the older couple across the aisle. They whispered quietly to each other, clearly disapproving of the man's behavior. Even Maya glanced back briefly, offering Marcus a small nod of appreciation. Though she hadn't asked for his help, his willingness to stand up for what was right resonated deeply with her. Frustrated and increasingly isolated, the man muttered under his breath and turned away, refusing to engage further. For the moment, he seemed content to stew in his own resentment. Yet Marcus knew better than to think this was the end of it. People like him rarely backed down completely. They simply bided their time, looking for opportunities to regain control. Meanwhile, Maya finished her meal and tucked her tray table away. She pulled out a book, hoping to lose herself in its pages and escape the lingering awkwardness. But as she flipped through the first few chapters, her thoughts kept drifting back to Marcus. His actions puzzled her. Why would a stranger go out of his way to intervene in someone else's conflict? Was he simply a naturally empathetic person, or was there more to his story? Curiosity got the better of her. After a few minutes, she turned, slightly in her seat, and looked over her shoulder. Marcus caught her eye and gave her a reassuring smile, as if to say, "Don't worry, I've got your back." It was a simple gesture, but it meant the world to Maya in that moment. Unbeknownst to either of them, the man beside Maya had also taken note of their brief interaction. Something about it gnawed at him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. Perhaps it was the realization that he was outnumbered, that his attempts to dominate the narrative were being quietly undermined by two people who refused to play along. As the hours passed, the plane continued its steady journey across the Atlantic. Outside, the sky grew darker, dotted with stars that twinkled faintly beyond the clouds. Inside, the cabin lights dimmed further for the overnight stretch, encouraging passengers to rest. Blankets were distributed, pillows adjusted, and most travelers drifted off to sleep, lulled by the gentle vibrations of the aircraft. Yet in row 15, the atmosphere remained charged. The man tossed and turned in his seat, unable to find comfort. Maya closed her eyes, feigning sleep to avoid further provocation, and Marcus, though physically distant, remained alert, sensing that the night was far from over. Somewhere above the vast ocean, tension simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to boil over. No one knew exactly what would happen next, but they all sensed that the true test of character was still to come. The plane cruised steadily through the night, its engines humming softly as it carried its passengers closer to their destination. Most of the cabin had fallen into a hushed stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of blankets or the faint snores of those who had succumbed to exhaustion. Yet in row 15, the quiet tension simmered like a pot on low heat, threatening to boil over at any moment. The man beside Maya had finally drifted off, or so it seemed. His head lolled awkwardly against the seat back, his mouth slightly open as he snored intermittently. For a brief while, Maya allowed herself to relax, grateful for the temporary reprieve. She closed her eyes, leaning her cheek against the cool window pane, and tried to focus on the rhythmic sound of the engines outside. Sleep, however, eluded her. Every time she began to drift off, she would catch herself wondering if the man might wake up angrier than before, ready to resume his tirade. Behind them, Marcus sat upright in his seat, wide awake, despite the late hour. He hadn't intended to stay vigilant all night, but something about the situation kept him alert. Perhaps it was the way the man's earlier behavior lingered in the air, unresolved. Or maybe it was the quiet strength Maya displayed that made him want to ensure nothing disrupted her peace again. Whatever the reason, Marcus found himself unable to fully unwind. It was during one of these moments of quiet observation that the man stirred suddenly, jerking awake with a start. He blinked groggily, disoriented by the dim lighting and the unfamiliar surroundings. When his gaze landed on Maya, seated calmly beside him, his expression darkened almost immediately. It was as though seeing her triggered a fresh wave of irritation, reigniting the embers of resentment he'd been nursing since their earlier exchanges. "You're still here," he muttered under his breath, his tone laced with disdain. Maya turned to look at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "Where else would I be?" she asked evenly, refusing to rise to the bait. He smirked, clearly pleased with himself for having goaded a response. "I don't know. Maybe somewhere else. Somewhere you actually belong." His words hung in the air, heavy and cutting. Nearby, passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pretending not to notice while others exchanged uneasy glances. The older couple across the aisle exchanged a worried look, their earlier whispers now replaced by silent concern. Maya took a deep breath, steeling herself against the sting of his comment. "This is my seat," she replied firmly, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "And I'm exactly where I need to be," the man chuckled, derisively shaking his head. "Sure, keep telling yourself that, but we both know how this works. People like you always end up where they don't fit in." "People like me?" Maya repeated, her voice rising just enough to draw attention. "What does that even mean?" "Oh, come on," he said, rolling his eyes. "Don't act like you don't know. You've seen the way people look at you, like they're wondering what you're doing in places you don't belong. Trust me, I've seen it plenty of times." Maya stared at him, incredulous. "You think your opinion matters? That your judgment defines who belongs where?" Before the man could respond, Marcus leaned forward once more, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Enough," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You've already said more than enough to embarrass yourself. Leave her alone." The man twisted around in his seat, glaring at Marcus. "Why are you so obsessed? With sticking your nose into other people's business, this has nothing to do with you. It does when your behavior makes everyone uncomfortable." Marcus shot back, his tone firm but controlled. "You've spent this entire flight insulting people, complaining about everything, and generally making a spectacle of yourself. Do us all a favor and stop." For a moment, the man looked as though he might explode. His face flushed red and his fists clenched tightly around the armrests. But then, instead of retreating as he had before, he stood abruptly, swaying slightly in the narrow aisle. "Fine," he spat, his voice loud enough to wake several nearby passengers. "If you two have such a problem with me, maybe you should find somewhere else to sit." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin as heads turned toward the commotion. Even the flight attendants paused mid-task, their expressions a mix of alarm and curiosity. The man's outburst had crossed a line, turning what had been a private conflict into a public spectacle. Marcus rose slowly from his seat, towering over the man with an imposing yet composed demeanor. "Sit down," he said quietly, his voice carrying an unshakable authority. "Now." The man hesitated, caught between indignation and fear. There was something about Marcus's unwavering gaze that unnerved him, stripping away the bravado he had worn like armor throughout the flight. After a tense pause, he reluctantly sank back into his seat, muttering under his breath but avoiding further eye contact. The cabin fell silent once more, save for the soft hum of the engines. Passengers exchanged glances, unsure whether to applaud Marcus's intervention or simply breathe a sigh of relief. Across the aisle, the older couple smiled faintly at Maya, offering a subtle nod of solidarity. It was clear that the tide had turned. The man's arrogance had been exposed for what it truly was, hollow and self-serving. As Marcus returned to his seat, Maya glanced back at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise. "Again?" He nodded, giving her a small, reassuring smile. "Just trying to help." Though the immediate crisis had passed, the atmosphere remained charged. The man slouched in his seat, sulking silently, while Maya focused on regaining her composure. Behind them, Marcus settled back into his chair, his thoughts racing. He knew this wasn't the end of the story, not entirely. Something told him that the final chapter was yet to unfold, and when it did, it would leave an indelible mark on everyone involved. Outside, the stars twinkled brightly against the velvet sky, indifferent to the drama unfolding within the plane. Inside, the passengers of Flight 247 continued their journey, unaware that the most unforgettable moment of their trip was still ahead. The hours ticked by, though time seemed to stretch endlessly for those in row 15. The man sat stiffly in his seat, his earlier bravado replaced by a simmering frustration. He stared straight ahead, refusing to make eye contact with anyone, but the tension radiating from him was palpable. Maya, on the other hand, appeared calm on the surface, though her mind raced with thoughts about what had just transpired. She couldn't help but wonder how someone could harbor so much disdain toward others without ever truly knowing them. Behind them, Marcus leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed over his chest. His expression was thoughtful, as if he were piecing together fragments of a puzzle. Something about the man's behavior gnawed at him, not just the arrogance or the rudeness, but the underlying insecurity that fueled it. People like this didn't lash out unless they felt threatened, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than met the eye. As the plane descended slightly, preparing for its final approach into Heathrow Airport, the cabin lights brightened, signaling the end of the overnight flight. Passengers stirred groggily, stretching their limbs and gathering their belongings. The older couple across the aisle exchanged warm smiles, whispering excitedly about their upcoming adventure in London. Nearby, a young mother coaxed her sleepy child awake, promising hot chocolate once they landed. But in row 15, the mood remained somber. The man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing furtively at Maya and then at Marcus. It was clear he was wrestling with something, perhaps regret, perhaps defiance, but whatever it was, it showed in the way his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie. Finally, unable to bear the silence any longer, he spoke. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he said abruptly, his voice low but tinged with bitterness. His words weren't directed at anyone in particular. Rather, they seemed aimed at the air itself, as if he needed to release the weight pressing down on him. Maya turned to look at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," she replied evenly. "But I do believe everyone deserves respect, even people who struggle to give it." Her response caught him off guard. For a moment, his mask of arrogance slipped, revealing a flicker of vulnerability beneath. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came out. Instead, he sank lower into his seat, his gaze dropping to his lap. Marcus watched the exchange intently, sensing that the man was teetering on the edge of an emotional precipice. Leaning forward slightly, he decided to push gently. "Why does it bother you so much?" he asked, his tone measured but probing. "Why does it matter to you what she's doing here or where she belongs?" The man stiffened, clearly unprepared for such a direct question. He hesitated, his jaw working, as if chewing over the words before finally speaking. "It's not about her," he muttered almost too quietly to hear. It's about me." Maya and Marcus exchanged a glance, both intrigued and unsettled by his admission. Sensing an opening, Marcus pressed further. "What about you?" The man sighed heavily, running a hand through his disheveled hair. For the first time since boarding the plane, he looked genuinely weary, less like the arrogant stranger who had mocked Maya and more like a man carrying a burden far heavier than anyone realized. "I used to be like you," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hard-working, determined, always trying to prove myself. But no matter how hard I tried, it never felt like enough. People looked at me and saw someone who didn't belong, someone who wasn't good enough." He paused, swallowing hard. "So I stopped caring, or at least I told myself I did, and now—" His voice trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. Maya listened intently, her anger giving way to empathy. She hadn't expected this, that behind the man's cruel words lay a lifetime of rejection and self-doubt. It didn't excuse his behavior, but it offered a glimpse into the pain that had shaped him. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression softening. "We all want to feel like we belong," he said quietly. "But tearing others down doesn't make us stronger. It only isolates us further." The man nodded faintly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his confession. For the first time in hours, the tension in the row began to ease. Not because the conflict was resolved, but because understanding had taken root. As the plane prepared for landing, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their descent into London. Outside the windows, the horizon glowed with the first light of dawn, painting the clouds in hues of pink and gold. Inside the cabin, passengers bustled about, eager to disembark after the long journey. When the wheels touched down with a gentle thud, applause erupted throughout the plane, a customary gesture of relief and gratitude shared among travelers. In row 15, however, the applause carried a different meaning. As the man unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, he hesitated for a moment, turning to face Maya. "I'm sorry," he said simply, his voice sincere. "For everything." Maya met his gaze, seeing not the arrogant stranger she had endured for hours, but a flawed human being, struggling to find his place in the world. She nodded, offering him a small smile. "Thank you," she replied softly. With that, the man turned and made his way toward the exit, disappearing into the crowd of passengers filing off the plane. Behind him, Maya and Marcus exchanged a look, wordlessly acknowledging the significance of what had just happened. As they gathered their belongings and joined the queue to deplane, Maya glanced back at Marcus one last time. "You know," she said, her voice filled with quiet admiration, You didn't have to do any of that, but I'm glad you did. Marcus smiled, shrugging modestly. Sometimes standing up for what's right is worth the effort. Together, they stepped off the plane and into the crisp morning air, leaving behind the confines of Flight 247 and the lessons it had taught them, forever etched in their memories. The terminal buzzed with the energy of travelers reuniting, collecting luggage and rushing toward their next destinations. For Maya and Marcus, however, the chaos around them faded into the background as they walked side by side through the crowded airport. Their steps were slow and deliberate, as if neither wanted to break the momentary bond forged during the turbulent flight. As they approached the baggage claim area, Maya glanced at Marcus, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I wasn't expecting today to turn out this way." Marcus chuckled lightly, adjusting the strap of his backpack on his shoulder. "Me neither. Honestly, I usually try to stay out of situations like that. But something about what was happening, it didn't feel right to just sit back and do nothing." Maya nodded, appreciating his honesty. Still, not everyone would have stepped in. Most people probably would have ignored it, or worse, agreed with him. She paused, her gaze drifting to the carousel where suitcases tumbled onto the conveyor belt. "It's easy to let moments like that pass without saying anything. But you didn't, and for that, I'm grateful." Marcus shrugged modestly, though a hint of pride flickered in his eyes. "We all have a choice to stand up or stay silent. Sometimes it's easier to look away. But when I saw how he was treating you, I couldn't just sit there. No one deserves to be treated like they don't matter." His words resonated deeply with Maya, stirring emotions she hadn't fully processed yet. Over the years, she had faced countless microaggressions and dismissive attitudes, enough to build walls around herself as a form of self-protection. Yet Marcus's actions reminded her that kindness could still cut through even the thickest barriers. It wasn't just about defending her. It was about affirming her worth in a world that often tried to diminish it. "I hope he finds some peace," Maya said after a moment, her tone reflective. "He clearly has a lot going on inside him. I don't think he's inherently bad, he's just lost." Marcus nodded in agreement. "Yeah, I got that sense too. People hurt others because they're hurting themselves. Doesn't excuse what he did, but it explains it. Maybe today will make him rethink how he treats people." They fell into a companionable silence as they waited for their bags. Around them, families embraced tearfully, friends laughed and hugged, and solo travelers scrolled through their phones, eager to begin their adventures. The contrast between the joy surrounding them and the tension they had left behind was stark, but not unwelcome. When Maya's suitcase finally appeared, she grabbed it off the carousel and turned to Marcus. "Well, this is me," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the exit. "Thanks again for everything. I doubt I'll forget this trip anytime soon." Marcus smiled warmly, extending his hand. "Likewise. Safe travels, Maya." She shook his hand firmly, noting the strength and sincerity in his grip. "You too, Marcus. Take care." With that, they parted ways, Maya heading toward the arrivals hall to meet her sister who had promised to pick her up, and Marcus disappearing into the crowd, his hoodie pulled up once more. Though their paths might never cross again, the connection they had formed lingered, a reminder that even fleeting encounters could leave lasting impressions. Hours later, as Maya sat in her hotel room overlooking the bustling streets of London, she found herself replaying the events of the flight in her mind. What had started as an ordinary journey had transformed into something extraordinary, an opportunity to confront prejudice, reaffirm her resilience, and witness the power of empathy firsthand. She realized that while the man's behavior had been hurtful, it had also served as a mirror, reflecting the biases and insecurities that existed in society and within herself. Meanwhile, Marcus wandered through Hyde Park, his thoughts drifting to the same events. He had always believed in standing up for what was right, but today had reminded him of the importance of compassion alongside conviction. The man's apology hadn't erased his earlier cruelty, but it had shown that change was possible, even in the unlikeliest of places, and somewhere else entirely. The arrogant man from the plane sat alone in a quiet cafe, staring blankly at his coffee cup. His bravado had crumbled under the weight of his own insecurities, leaving him raw and vulnerable. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to reflect on his actions, not just on the flight, but throughout his life. Perhaps, he thought, it wasn't too late to start over. In the days that followed, each of them carried the lessons of Flight 247 with them. Maya returned to work with renewed determination, inspired by the knowledge that she wasn't alone in facing adversity. Marcus continued his travels, carrying the memory of the encounter as a reminder of the impact small acts of courage could have, and the man, though still grappling with his flaws, began taking tentative steps toward becoming someone better, not for anyone else, but for himself. What none of them realized was that their shared experience had created ripples far beyond the confines of the aircraft. In a world often divided by differences, their story stood as proof that humanity could prevail, even in the most unexpected ways. As the sun set over London, casting golden light across the city, Maya leaned against her hotel window and smiled. The journey ahead promised challenges, but she felt ready to face them. After all, she now knew one undeniable truth. No matter how dark the skies became, there would always be stars shining somewhere, if only we chose to look for them.